I feel lonely deep inside, and I wanna talk about it. Can I trust you on my side? Cause I wanna talk about it. Can you keep a secret? Keep a secret. Can you keep a secret? Keep a secret. Can you keep a secret? I wanna trust you. I wanna trust you. So can you keep my secret? You see this road gets tough, gets cold, but still never lose that hope. You got everything it takes and more. You're not alone in this war. Help is on the way every other day. You can lean on my shoulders, cause you are superhuman. You got my trust, and together we can be stronger. So we can talk about it. Yeah, we can talk about it, yeah. So we can talk about it, yeah, let's talk about it, yeah. I feel lonely deep inside, and I wanna talk about it. Can I trust you on my side? Cause I wanna talk about it. Can you keep a secret? Keep a secret. Can you keep a secret? Keep a secret. Can you keep a secret? I wanna trust you. I wanna trust you. So can you keep my secret?
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Psychcast Diaries. Can you keep a secret diaries? My name is Juanita Headley. I am a New York attorney and the founder and CEO of Changing Cases. You are listening to a set of discussions dealing with the issues of human trafficking, child abuse prevention, and of course, knowing how to respond to the question, can you keep a secret? Over the following weeks and months, I'm going to take a look at some hard-hitting topics with a view to educate, empower, and inspire you to change the way that you think, act, and respond to better safeguard the children in your world. Stay tuned until the end of this show, where I'll be sharing with you how you can get a copy of my new book, Can You Keep a Secret?, how you can find out about my weekly Zoom meetings, and also my podcasts. Today, I'm thoroughly excited to have on the show Matt Friedman. Matt, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Now, for those of you who've heard these sessions before, you would know that usually I use multiple devices. And as I mentioned last week, unfortunately, I was unwise in placing a bottle of sealed cream in my bag. It somehow exploded and has destroyed my laptop. So therefore, although I usually use the phone and laptop, I'm using multiple phones. The phone is about 6 or 7 years old. So I need some grace if I'm not able to read his bio as eloquently as I have done previously. Now, Matthew Friedman, is a leading internationally renowned global expert on modern slavery and human trafficking, an award-winning public speaker, author, filmmaker, and philanthropist. Friedman regularly advises heads of governments and intelligence agencies. As the founder and CEO of the Mekong Club, Friedman is considered the leading catalyst of the anti-slavery movements in Asia's business sector by captains of industry. The Mekong Club is one of the first international not-for-profit organizations of its kind based in Asia to use a business-to-business approach to fight slavery, bridging the gap between the public and private sectors. The Mekong Club helps companies of all sizes to understand the complexities of human trafficking and to reduce their vulnerability within their supply chain's business environment. Together with business partners, the Mekong Club is spearheading innovative and strategic projects to achieve a slave-free world. In 2017, Friedman received the prestigious Asia Communicator of the Year Gold Award for giving more than 800 presentations to 80,000 people, including government leaders and the Vatican, on the topic of modern slavery within a 5-year period in different countries. Friedman has the unique and powerful speaking style that inspires people and helps them reach their fullest potential. Each year, he is cited at least 40 times in the news media, CNN, Bloomberg, Reuters, Associated Press, the Financial Times, The Economist, etc., and invited to speak at major international conferences around the world. He has managed and directed tens of millions of dollars to major humanitarian portfolios, impacting millions of people in the World Bank, the US State Department, and the United Nations. His work over the last 30 years of pioneering and managing international anti-human trafficking projects from Nepal, Bangladesh, Thailand, and Hong Kong has given him access to many influential networks in different countries throughout the world. Friedman is the author of 12 books ranging from action novels, non-fiction accounts of his human rights work, to a book that outlines his unique philosophy of time. A longtime supporter of film and the media arts, Friedman was an executive producer and advisor on 4 award-winning films, one of which was nominated for an Emmy and another executive produced by Emma Thompson. Friedman has launched a new global campaign called Be the Hero, and has published a book to go with it, entitled Be the Hero, Be the Change, published on Amazon in March 2020. He believes that the collective actions of ordinary people have the greatest chance of effecting a real transformation. He considers everyone who volunteers, no matter how big or small the gesture, to be heroic. Friedman is represented by international speaker agencies and provides a range of international keynote speeches to teach, mentor, and motivate people from all walks of life to step up and take a stand in life. He has an uncanny ability to take something as complicated and confusing as slavery and break it down into a series of simple messages that walk an audience down a path to understanding. He has shifted the mindsets of many, even the most resistant detractors. He is always a message of hope. Friedman is married to Sylvia U. Friedman, who is an award-winning journalist, filmmaker, international speaker, and author of Silence No More, Voices of Comfort Women. She also fights the scourge of modern slavery, and together in the summer of 2016, they gave 113 presentations in 27 US cities. Friedman has done speaking tours in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Singapore. Matt, is there anything in addition you'd like to add from what I've just shared?
Oh my gosh! Wow, that who is that guy that you're talking about? No, actually, I think that pretty much covers everything. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome, and I'm amazed. I remember when we first met last year sometime via Zoom, and we spoke about doing programs, and it's almost a year later that we're finally getting things off the ground. But I'm truly amazed. I've not yet had the chance to read your bio, and as I read it there, I was like, wow, you're doing such amazing stuff. You've made a huge impact, and I believe you'll continue to do so. So really, I am amazed. And I trust the audience likewise will be inspired by all that you've managed to do. And even the title of your book, it makes me think of Gandhi, be the change you want to see. And the fact that you see every one of us who volunteers as heroes, I think that's truly inspiring, because it encourages and reminds people that no matter how small an impact they make, it is definitely worthwhile. It's like a drop in the pond. Every small drop in the pond will certainly make a difference. Of course, I know that you've lived much of your life in the US and of course in Hong Kong. Can you share with us a bit about the culture in Hong Kong? What's the difference between Hong Kong and your experiences in the US? For those who've never been there, particularly with the lockdown, did you have culture shock? Just so we can get a bit of an understanding of what it's like in Hong Kong.
Well, anyone who's lived in New York City would be able to relate very quickly to Hong Kong. It's a big metropolis. There's about 8.4 million people. It's a beautiful city. It's surrounded by mountains. For me, the culture shock wasn't so much coming to Hong Kong. It was other Asian cities that I lived in. I lived in Nepal for 8 years, Bangladesh for 5 years, Thailand for 10 years, but traveled to over 42 countries to do work related to modern slavery, including many of the Asian countries. You know, when you're in Asia, you're experiencing all different types of cultures and people. Some of them are very sophisticated, like Hong Kong. Others are less developed, like Nepal. When you're in Nepal, it feels like you're in another planet. When you're in Hong Kong, it could be any international city. But the adjustment for Hong Kong wasn't too bad, simply because I had traveled to so many other countries prior to it.
Can you share with us how you first ended up in Asia? Of course, you've shared about spending a number of years in Nepal. How did you first get there? What led you to moving and uprooting yourself from the US to being in Asia?
Much of my work when I first started my career in the United States was in international development. Now, to do international development, you have to actually spend some serious time in a country. So prior to going to Nepal, I would do short trips to different parts of Africa, to Asia, to Latin America. But in order to really understand what happens on the ground, I needed a long-term stay. So I took a fellowship in Nepal. I was supposed to be there about 8 months, but I enjoyed the experience so much that I stayed for 8 years. And at the time, I was working for USAID, and I was a public health officer.
Can you share with us what you love most about Nepal? Because for myself, I've spent time in India, and I know the cultures are very similar, but can you share with us what did you love most about it? Was it the food, the culture? Because of course, every person's experience is different, and I'm sure it has vastly changed from when you were living there to how it is now.
Yeah, I think there were two things that, one was the people. They're just amazing people. They live a lifestyle that in some cases is like going back 500 years. I lived in Kathmandu, but if you go 10 kilometers outside of the city, you're in locations that don't have electricity. They're living the way they had for generation after generation. The other is the sheer beauty of the country. Nepal is where Mount Everest is, and you have some of the largest mountains in the world. So just amazing terrain, amazing sights of the mountains, the plains. It was just such a fascinating, interesting experience.
And thank you for sharing. And I know for me personally that India, for myself, is actually one of my favorite countries, or the favorite country. The culture, the community, the food is rather too spicy for my liking, but I really do love the people there. And I feel that when we get to experience new cultures, it can give us a greater acceptance and a greater appreciation for our home country. Out of interest, what did you miss the most from the US? And when you've been overseas for all of these years, what was it truly like for you? Did you ever feel like, I miss home, I want to go back? Or have you fully embraced the culture? Are you fluent in the language, let's say in Nepal and in Hong Kong? Can you share a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in the United States, as you indicated. I would go to Nepal for a year and then go home to the United States. When I was home, what I missed most was just kind of being an ordinary person. When you live in a less developed country, you're always that other person who's there. I missed my family. I missed the ease at which you can just kind of live your life. When you're in a country like Nepal or Bangladesh, there's a certain baseline of chaos that exists all the time. And, that baseline of chaos isn't in the United States, but I feel like in some ways I'm drawn to it. I like the fact that there is uncertainty and things change so much, and there are issues and problems that need to be addressed, because if you're doing international development work, you go to the places where the issues are, and certainly Nepal was one of those places.
And of course, you spoke about going to where the issues are, and we know that you've been doing a lot of work fighting human trafficking. What led you into this work of human trafficking? How did you first come to the realization that we have slaves now more than ever before? How did you first enter into this line of work?
Well, I was a public health officer. I was living and working in Nepal. I had the HIV/AIDS portfolio, and we were finding girls 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive. Now, if you know anything about Nepal, it's a very conservative culture, so we should not have had that disease among that age group. So we went to go and interview them and heard pretty much the same story over and over again. It went something like this. Human trafficker would go into a village, flash a bunch of money around to indicate he was rich. Then he'd say, I'm looking for a wife. I don't want an urban wife, I want a village wife. He'd find a girl, 11, 12 years old, befriend her, and then go to the family and say, I want to marry your daughter. They're saying, wow, he's rich, he's handsome, going to take care of our daughters, going to take care of us. They go through the wedding ceremony, he goes to the family and says, okay, I'll be back in about 3 months, but don't worry, you'll see your daughter then. But that isn't what's going to happen. Instead of taking her to Kathmandu, he takes her to Mumbai, India, to the red light district, puts her in a room, and it says, honey, just stay here. I'll be back in a few minutes. As she was coming in, she saw these people milling around. She said, no, don't leave me here. He says, it's okay. I'll be right back. He then goes to the madam to get the $500 for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold from the wedding, and he hands the wedding pictures over. He then leaves to go back to Nepal to do it again and again, maybe marrying 40, 50 girls a year. The madam goes into the room where the girl is and says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with 20 guys a day every day because I say so. You can imagine her shock. No, my husband loves me. Oh, that's what happened. When she comes to internalize this, many of the girls say, I'll kill myself before I do those shameful things. The madam then takes out the photo of the wedding and says, this is your mom, your dad, your brother. If you hurt yourself, we'll hurt you and them. In order to make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You shame her. You bring in a couple of professional rapists, and over a 2-day period of time, they'll rape this poor 12-year-old girl 20, 30, 40 times until she just lays back, accepts whatever happens to her. Then she's put on the line. She'll be with 20 guys a day, every day, until after a couple of years, she gets sick. They throw her out in the street, and these were the girls that we were seeing. So it was seeing this story play out over and over and over again that really drew me in the direction of feeling like, wow, now that I've seen this, I can't close my eyes to it. And that's kind of how I initially got involved.
As you're sharing there, I'm just blown away. It sounds so fictitious, but I know, having been to India and met survivors of trafficking, that what you're saying is very, very close to the reality of what goes on. It is not just something we see in movies, but it is unfortunately what is truly going on today, and not just in a place like Nepal or India, but it has various variations and takes place in the West as well. And even when you mentioned professional rapists, I mean, I've heard traffickers and pimps sometimes refer to themselves as businessmen and don't think they're doing anything wrong. They see it as providing a service. It's about supply and demand. But for those who are kind of taken aback by what you've said, what exactly is a professional rapist? I mean, even just saying that, it's quite uncomfortable. And I know what you mean. But for those who maybe never heard such a term used before, can you expand on that?
Yeah, professional rapist would be a person who is brought in because they have developed a certain talent of breaking a girl. Now, generally what we see in Mumbai is that you'll get a couple of guys, they often come in drunk, and they will taunt her, they will swear at her, they will belittle her, they'll say she's a whore, they'll say all kinds of things to basically just break her down. And each time she resists, they push back, they push back, they push back, until she eventually learns that if she doesn't do anything, if she just lays back and accepts it, she's not going to be abused. And this process is very regimented. And in Mumbai, there used to be a particular location where they would break girls in. It was kind of like a rape house. And they did it because they wanted the girl to go from just somebody who was a regular person to a person who would accept clients in a very short period of time. So that breaking in process was extremely important to the business.
And even as you're sharing there, I've just observed that you shared very matter of fact. And I wonder, how have you been able to sleep at night? I mean, thinking the fact that you've met so many survivors and that you've heard so many horrendous stories, how are you able to share it without becoming emotional, without crying? Have you ever had a story that's really traumatized or impacted you? And how do you manage to contain your composure when you talk about such horrendous things?
Well, it's been 30 years since I started doing this. And so, after a while, you develop a certain amount of defense mechanisms. But I guess the story that put me over the top was I was invited by the Indian government to do public health checks in India, in those brothels. I had a police officer with me, went into one of the brothels, and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. Now, this girl saw an opportunity, literally ran up and wrapped herself around me and said, save me, save me. They're doing terrible things to me. I looked down at this child who was hysterically crying, wearing a dress 20 sizes too big because she was a child in an adult world. I turned to the police officer and said, we need to get her out of here. So we can't do that. So what are you talking about? You're a cop. He says, well, if we try to leave, they'll kill us both. To make a long story short, we left. We came back with a lot more police, but of course the girl was gone. Now, I tell this story because every once in a while, God puts on our heart a test. This was my test. I should have gotten that girl out. And when I look back, I can think of 20 things that I could have probably have done and succeeded. After that, I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I was super traumatized by it. But what it did is it got me to cross over the line to going from a non-activist to an activist. And so basically, I surrendered to the fact that now that I know about this, this is what I'm going to do with my life. And 30 years later, here I am talking to you. The other thing is, I've had periods in my life where I've said, I can't do this anymore. I've just thrown the towel in. I've been so affected by it. And I eventually keep coming back because there's something in the DNA of people like me who do this type of work that prevents us from turning our backs. We are drawn to it because there's something about the injustice that continues to draw us in.
I want to ask, because you made reference to God. Would you say you feel that this is a God-given calling that you have on your life? And if that's the case, is there any sort of scripture or any verse or chapter of the Bible that really speaks to you, particularly when you have moments like this with the young girl that you were unable to rescue?
Yeah, I mean, I read the scripture regularly. It's not any one verse. I guess it's just my faith in general. As Christians, we're supposed to do fellowship and worship and prayer, but we also need to apply our faith. And so for me, the idea of doing good deeds and doing it because it's what we need to do with who we are as Christians. The fact that God has given me the ability to plan, to do public speaking, to raise money, to be able to sit down with victims means that I need to use these. And I've always felt compelled as a result of that to honor my faith and my God with the deeds that I do. And part of my emphasis on the Be the Hero concept, which looks at not only human trafficking, but any issue that needs help, is based on the same idea. We as fellow human beings have to help the world and people to heal. And it's very much in the scriptures, many, many passages that are related to that.
And as you're just sharing there, what comes to mind is two scriptures. The first one is about the 5 talents, because at the end of the day, everyone does have a calling, and the Lord has given us a ministry, and it's for us to live out that ministry and not to bury those talents in the ground. And then the other scripture that I'm thinking of is, well done, good and faithful servant, because there are people like yourself, and I'm sure that you're so humble, you won't even want to hear me say this, but there are people like you who are 5 talent individuals, and you're very few and far between. And it's like you see a need, and you want to meet the need whatever way you can. You're not going to be limited by language barrier, by resources. The Lord has given you life and life abundantly, and you're making an impact. And again, I am so amazed by all you've managed to accomplish in your young years. And I really pray that the Lord is going to give you many more years to continue in this fight. But of course, you mentioned about your faith and about God. When it comes to the church, what would you say that you feel the church is truly doing when it comes to this issue?
Well, there are many faith-based groups around the world that are addressing modern slavery. One of the things that is most important for a trafficking victim to get is healing through forgiveness. And that's one of the things that Christian church offers. Not all faiths offer this. In certain faiths, you have a situation where, because of what is described as karma, you did these things and you can't erase them, then you're stuck with them. A person who is a victim of human trafficking is often a victim of circumstances. They are tricked and deceived and eventually forced into a situation where they had no involvement. It has nothing to do with them. It has to do with the people who perpetrated the crime. And so being able to forgive yourself and to allow for the shame and the guilt to go away is very much a part of our faith. And so when it comes to the protection side of things, after a person has been in a human trafficking situation, churches can be very effective at offering counseling and prayer and rehabilitation and love and caring and compassion and kindness, all of those characteristics that are so much a part of what a person needs in that circumstance. Another thing is churches can be very helpful in raising funds to allow for the frontline organizations to go out and do what they need to do, to prevent people from being trafficked, to go after the women and the girls that are in the brothels, that are in these circumstances, to prosecute the cases so that the business is closed down. All of those different types of activities can be done through faith-based groups, and they often are all over Asia and the world.
As you're sharing there, I'm wondering what exactly would you say are the major causes that leads to an individual being trafficked? What's coming to mind as you're speaking is about being displaced, for example, being a refugee. But from your line of work, particularly when we think about Asia, what are some of the main reasons that a person would become susceptible, at risk, or end up being exploited when it comes to human trafficking?
I think one of the big problems is just a lack of general awareness. The problem with this part of the world is face. Now, what I mean by face is that if a person were to get trafficked, let's say from Myanmar to Thailand, when they go home, they generally would not tell people they were trafficked because they would lose face by doing that. And so what happens is you have all of these people who end up leaving their country, going to another country, getting caught up in a trafficking type situation. But when they come back, they lie. And so there isn't this message to the general public to say, don't leave, because if you do, you could be trafficked, because nobody's reinforcing that. So that's one of the biggest issues that I face. I was once in a Myanmar village and I was trying to talk about safe migration, and I had somebody raise their hand and say, well, we don't know what you're talking about. None of us have ever been trafficked. All of those guys over there, have gone to Thailand and none of them had a problem. And I knew that every one of those guys had been trafficked. I knew it, but the community didn't. And so this inability to kind of translate the reality of the situation, that there are people in other locations that are going to aggressively try to exploit you, is really hard to get across to people who just don't have kind of a common experience. And I'll just say one more thing about that. In the United States, if you're a victim, you tell people, and everybody's heart opens up and says, oh my gosh, wow, can I help you? That's so terrible. There's compassion and love and caring. But in much of the world, I see it in Africa, I see it in Latin America, I see it in Asia, this concept of face can be a real problem.
And I was just thinking, actually, the scripture, people perish for lack of knowledge, because as you rightly said, they point to those nearby and say they've never been trafficked, but that's because they don't have the knowledge and the support is not there because of the shame culture and saving face. Whereas in a place like the US or the UK, we will support, we will listen to that individual and see them as a victim, and not see them as a person who has put themselves in a position to be trafficked. Because we know that there is a blame culture, particularly when it comes to women and rape, where we would put the blame on the female. What was she wearing? Where was she going, etc. In the Asian community, they wouldn't have that same sense of understanding that we have, that this person did absolutely nothing. They were simply trying to better their life, and they were taken advantage of. Would you say that poverty is one of the major reasons that leads people to be trafficked, particularly in Asia? Because I know that when I talk about trafficking, no matter where I'm in the world, poverty is the first thing people think of. But of course, when I look at the list of vulnerabilities, it's more than that. It could be your gender, your ethnicity, not speaking the language, being displaced, disability, etc. Would you say poverty is a main issue of vulnerability when it comes to Asia?
I think it's one of many vulnerabilities. I would say it is one of the main ones, partly because if you are desperate, if you don't have money, you're going to make choices that are going to put you into a situation where maybe you can get trafficked. Perfect example is the COVID situation that we're facing now. What we're seeing, let's say in Bangladesh, is a situation where a lot of people lost their job, and they relied on that paycheck every week to not support not only themselves, but their entire family. And this is both women and men. When they are sent home and quarantined, their savings run out very quickly. They borrow money, but they can't pay it back. And so traffickers take advantage of that. They'll come in and say, well, if you can't pay me, I need that person there or that person there to come with me to go and work for a year to pay off the debt. And so it's because of their poverty that they're in a situation that they don't have savings. They don't have, a safety net that protects them. But it's not just poverty. I did a survey in Bangladesh where we looked at the vulnerability of people, and just about everyone in Bangladesh is poor. Many of them make about $2 a day, which is, imagine having to live on that, not only yourself and your family. But what we found is that while the vulnerability was equal across the board, the difference between a location that had trafficking and a location that didn't was simply having a trafficker there. So, if you use vulnerability as a means of determining things, it's not enough. You have to find out whether or not there's a history in that location of human trafficking taking place. And it's a great way of determining if you have a problem. Go into a community and say, do you have any traffickers here? Have you heard about the issue? If they say no, go to the next one until you find it and focus on those areas, because the presence of a trafficker is the biggest vulnerability that any community will ever have.
Well, what measures are in place at the moment to be able to safeguard individuals from being trafficked? Because even what you shared there, it makes me think of when I'm in, for example, Tobago, which is the neighboring island of Trinidad. They're twin islands. And when I speak about human trafficking, there are very few people who turn up in attendance because they say it's not happening here. But like you're sharing there, if the vulnerability exists in a community, it's just for that trafficker to land there and to take advantage. And even when you mentioned about these men who would have these false marriages, take the person, the woman, the girl, to a brothel, go back and have another fake marriage, back and forth, back and forth. When I hear that, I just think it's absolutely crazy. But the fact is, it's not crazy, it's what's happening. And as you just mentioned earlier, no one is saying anything. So even if the girl returned home, nobody would have any idea what has happened, which makes it difficult for her to be able to protect or prevent that from happening to somebody else.
Well, let me give you two stories related to that. If the girl is lucky enough not to have succumbed to a serious disease and she can go back to her community in Nepal, she would never tell anyone that she had that experience, because she wouldn't be allowed to go back to her family. She wouldn't be able to get a husband. She'd bring shame to herself and to her community. And I saw this firsthand. There was a situation where there was a young girl. She was walking down the street. A van came, pulled her in. They drove her to Calcutta, across the border into India. She was used for about 2 weeks, and then a raid and rescue took place, and we managed to get her back to Bangladesh. So we knew where she lived. I happened to be in the van with the NGO to take her back. We assumed that the family hadn't heard about this, but they had. And when we got there, you had the father, the mother, and all the siblings lined up on one side, and then you had me and the NGO worker and this victim. And the father said, "No, go away. You can't come home." The girl said, "Well, I didn't do anything." And he said, "It doesn't matter. You brought shame to the family." She kept pleading with him. I didn't make any decisions that got me into this. I'm a complete victim. He said, "It doesn't matter. We will not be able to get your brothers and sisters married if you come home, and so you just have to leave. That's it. You're done with here." And that attitude of not accepting victimization is a prominent part of many cultures all across Asia. And until you can find a way of addressing that and changing that, a lot of victims are just trapped in this situation. They have no place to go back to. They get trafficked into a brothel, and even if they were able to leave, there's no place to go. And so, in Bangladesh, if you're a woman in prostitution, you can't wear shoes. And everyone knows you're a prostitute simply because you're not wearing shoes. And so there's this stigma that sticks with a person, that stays with that individual, that just doesn't go away.
How do you think this could change? And of course, we don't live in an ideal world, but how do you think that this could change, where that young woman or girl can return back to family? Because even as you're sharing that, I've read and I've heard so many stories such as this, and it's very disheartening that because of something that happened to her, it would bring shame to her family, that would prevent her siblings from being married. And I even think about if that was the case in the entire world. I'm an only child by God's grace, but I have half siblings and step siblings. And so I'm thinking, as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, then I would have brought shame to my half siblings and step siblings, and they would never be able to be married. And I would end up feeling ashamed about something that has happened to me when I had no responsibility. I was a 4-year-old child. And even with this young girl you mentioned, she was kidnapped. That's what happened there. What do you think would need to change in the society for things to be different? And of course, I know that with God, all things are possible, but just on a practical level, what would need to change for this no longer to be a challenge where shame and stigma prevents a victim from returning home to her family and being ostracized outside of the entire community?
Yeah, I often struggle with that question, but what I've done with interventions is For example, in Bangladesh and in Mongolia, we did soap operas. And what we would do is we would hire writers and actresses and do a maybe 10 or 12 1-hour soap opera, 1 hour per session. And then we would use fiction as a means of dramatizing the experiences that people have to help people to develop a sense of empathy and understanding and compassion from watching these things. And so part of the reason why I've always found that particular approach works in much of the world's storytelling is the way that you convey a message. It's not through legal changes, it's not through laws, it's not through didactic presentations in front of people where you show PowerPoints. It's about telling stories, helping people to feel the pain of the individual, and then to kind of think through it and feel through it, to get to a point where they internalize the fact that what I'm seeing is definitely wrong. This needs to change. And that's the type of thing that's really required in these types of cultures, is to help offer a means of people experiencing what the problem is so that the tradition can change. Now, one of the things that I've often heard is it's our tradition. Well, I believe in traditions, but there are good traditions and bad traditions, and the bad traditions need to replace with good traditions. And so just because it's tradition doesn't mean it's good. And just because it's part of a culture doesn't mean it's wholesome and right. Many cultures have changed over time. I just look at the United States, the changes that we've gone through in the last couple of 100 years is from being a very rebellious, rowdy kind of country to one that's has systems and procedures in place. And we've had many issues related to women and race and slavery and various other things that we've sorted out over time. In Asia, they haven't gone through those transitions yet, but they can and they should.
And even as you speak about telling stories, I think about Jesus who told parables and how effective those stories were. In fact, it would ruffle a lot of feathers. And for me personally, when I want to communicate a message effectively, I use storytelling. I feel that by stats and numbers being shared to the layperson who maybe doesn't care about it or doesn't think this issue is happening in their community, that is going to detach them from what they're hearing. But when you can make it real and personalized, they're truly able to connect. In fact, I shared a story just over the Easter weekend with over 1,000 people about a student in one of the Caribbean islands who was 10 in primary school. And when I had come to this primary school, I was a bit overwhelmed because of how young the children were, and I don't feel comfortable bringing my message of sexual abuse, human trafficking to such a young age. But I rise to the challenge and I watered down my message, which is really for ages 11 upwards. And at the end of the presentation, which was very brief, the students asked me loads and loads of questions. And one student in particular kept asking lots of questions. In fact, one of the students, which was her friend, they were sitting together, said, "What if you're being sexually abused? What do you do?" And I said, "Tell your teacher." "What if you're too afraid to tell your teacher?" I was like, "Write a note and give it to your teacher." "What if you're too afraid to write a note and give it to your teacher?" I was like, "Write a note and leave it on the teacher's desk." And so I said to the teacher, "Tomorrow you're going to have a lot of notes on your desk." Unfortunately, I never heard from her again, so I don't know if she got many notes. But another teacher that was in the room that was quite resistant to my message on can you keep a secret and why you need to respond affirmatively for the person to open up to you about their secret. And then once you've heard it, you go off and phone the authorities. Despite her original resistance, by the end of the presentation, she understood that I was not advocating secret keeping. I was simply saying, when a child asks you, a young person, adult asks you, can you keep a secret? Is it confidential? Respond affirmatively. Once you've heard the secret, you tell them your next steps, you inform the authorities. The students were empowered. They knew what to do. In fact, one of the students, he even said that if somebody came up to him, asked him if he can keep a secret, and then told him to do bad stuff for money, he said he would take the money and run away. I said, please don't do that. But that teacher, at the end of school, when I was doing a PTA meeting for about 20 minutes, the resistant teacher came up to me and she said, that student, that girl that kept asking a lot of questions, she disclosed that there is a man offering her $100 to have sex with her. And so when I heard that, for me, I was really amazed that I had just presented, and my presentation had given her that courage to disclose instantly. But then at the same time, I wondered, well, why hasn't she told her parents? And that is the thing, like you've mentioned there about the shame in the Asian culture, in the Caribbean and African culture, often when you disclose, you'll be disbelieved or shamed. But of course, for me, to empower people, not just that student, but others, it's all about storytelling. And I've got a book I'm trying to sell. So I've been using that story to get people to buy the book. And people are buying the book, which is brilliant. However, not everybody is going to get that opportunity. So we've got to go further afield. You've presented many times to large audiences, but as we both know, there are still so many people who have not heard your message or my message. How is media used, and what is media used in what way for the purpose of educating people on this topic? Can you share with us, particularly because you do have a lot of experience from the media perspective, how is it being used and what is being done in the media in relation to human trafficking?
I think that the media could be used a lot more effectively than they are. I mean, generally what we hear are stories in the written press, for example, about human trafficking, and it gives a few details related to what's happening, or you will see a news expose on television that talks about it. I think part of the problem is that we don't get enough information from that to really form in our mind a framework of understanding exactly what we're talking about, that there are 40 million people in modern slavery, that 9.2 million people enter per year, that 25,000 people enter a day, that every 4 seconds a person is entering into it, that there's 4.2 million women and girls who are used, by men every single day, kind of what I would describe as a commercial rape against their will, forced into having sex with 4, 5, 8, 10 guys a day. I mean, those messages just really don't kind of convey kind of the gravity of what we're dealing with here. You know, I have this one story that I tell based on a woman named Gita. And the story goes something like this. You know, I was living and working in Nepal, desperately wanted to do something to help address modern slavery, so I decided I was going to write a book. I went from one shelter to the next. I was interviewing the women and the girls, and it was a girl named Gita. And any time I approached her, she said, no, I don't want to basically talk about what happened to me. But she sat and listened to all my other interviews. When I finished and I was leaving, Gita comes running up and says, I changed my mind. You can have my story. I was thrilled. So she sat on one side of the table. The rest of us sat on the other side of the table. And over a 3-hour period, she told the worst story I'd ever heard of rape and torture and disease and murder and betrayal. I honestly didn't know what to say to this girl. Finally, I turned to her and I said, wow, Gita, you must be so angry at the traffickers for the horrific things that they did to you. She paused. And then she said, no, I'm angry at you and you and you. She pointed at us. She said, where were you? So that every single day she woke up praying for somebody to come and help. Nobody came. So that she went to school till she was 12. She knew that everything around her was right out in the open. Nobody was doing anything. She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. She said they're just bad people being bad people. She said she was angry at the good people, at society, for allowing a 15-year-old girl to have been raped 7,000 times to eventually get a disease which will eventually kill her. Now, I tell this story because Gita repeatedly said to me, why is it that when, there isn't in the newspaper, 15-year-old girl commercially raped 7,000 times? Imagine if any of our newspapers had that. Imagine if they went into the description of what happened to this. This happens to 4.2 million people a year. Why doesn't that happen? I think part of it is that the media feels like people don't want to listen to this. They don't want to hear about this. They don't want to know about it. It's sad. It's depressing. People being in this type of situation. Nobody wants to, having a good day today. I don't want to read that terrible stuff. But we got to get over that. If we were to read that in the local paper where I grew up, everyone would be saying, who is this girl? Where is she? Is she okay? All this other stuff. But nobody's saying that because nobody's really reporting. So I think part of the problem that I have is the media needs to be sensitized. They have to do a better job of understanding what the issue is. The one media outlet that's doing probably the best job is CNN. CNN has taken on the Freedom Project. They have Freedom Day, March 16th every year. and they go and they aggressively try to help students around the world to understand the issue and so forth. But we need a lot more of that to happen.
And of course, it's a mammoth undertaking. And as I said earlier, with God, all things are possible, but he doesn't need to send angels on this earth to rectify, to intervene. He can use people just like myself and you. And it's disheartening and it is disappointing to hear that these things are not being reported accurately or they're being sensationalized. When we have movies like Pretty Woman, which sensationalize being a prostitute, or even recently, I believe it's called The Hustlers with Jennifer Lopez, there are girls who would aspire to take the role that she did working in a strip club. Now, of course, I know that this kind of work comes with its challenges, and self-care is truly important, because when we hear these things, it can really affect us, because there's only so much that we can do. We cannot change the world. It requires so many of us to come together, to be united, because pimps and traffickers, we know they are united. Even if they dislike each other, there is unity. And I feel that there needs to be a lot more unity in the body of Christ in relation to this, a lot more unity with organizations. Too often we are competing with one another, or we are replicating what they're already doing. But of course, your faith is important to you, as you have shared. What are some of the challenges that you have experienced as a Christian, particularly in this field? We know that God is all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful. We know that he dwells and lives within you. But of course, as it says in James chapter 1, we will be persecuted, and it isn't easy. There'll be naysayers, negativity, and sometimes from people who are Christian just like you. What are some of the challenges you face in your Christian walk, and how do you overcome them?
Okay, so out of 40 million people, last year, with all of the NGOs, the governments, and the United Nations combined, we helped about 0.2%, not even 0.5% of them. Out of the 500,000 criminals, I think we put about 7,000 in jail, which is 0.8%. Now, as a person who's been doing this work for a long time, it's extremely discouraging to recognize that the impact that we're having is minuscule. It's kind of a drop in the ocean, if you will. And so, I think what my faith does more than anything else is it offers a sense of hope. Hope for the fact that, well, we may not have or have come up with the silver bullet to address this yet. There are certain things that can and should be done in the future that could perhaps change the odds against this. For example, bringing the private sector into this, getting the banks involved so that the banks can look at transactions to see whether nefarious things are taking place to close down bad businesses. Getting, organizations that do manufacturing involved, because part of what we're dealing with here in human trafficking isn't just all sex trafficking. About 75% of what we're dealing with is forced labor. And so having companies look at their supply chains, where the manufacturing is taking place, go deep into the supply chains, identify where this abuse is taking place, and then this can be used as a means of addressing the problem. Hotels can step up and identify whether or not sex trafficking is taking place. Much of kind of my faith basically helps me to understand that for me to continue moving forward, I have to have a belief that there is good in this world, there is light in this world, that darkness can be overcome with light, and that unity of purpose through people uniting and coming together can make a difference. So once again, much of my faith is based on basic Christian tenets of unity and compassion and collectiveness and prayer. All of those elements are extremely important when it comes to doing the type of work that I do.
I know you made reference earlier to silver bullet, and I'm curious to know, of course, you mentioned forgiveness earlier, which is truly important. Forgiveness is important for us. It's about not thinking that when we eat rat poison, the other person will die. And so forgiveness is crucial, and our faith is all about forgiveness. But I would be interested to know, what are your views when it comes to the death penalty, and what do you believe is an appropriate penalty for perpetrators of human trafficking?
I'm going to talk about forgiveness in another way here for a moment, and that is many of the women who are pimps, who are madams, and many of the men who are pimps were themselves abused. And so what you have is a situation where a girl was trafficked when she was 11. She was in the brothel for 5 years, selling her body. And then she was no longer getting clients, but had no place to go. So she moved up in the hierarchy of the system. She had no other world to explore. And so she went from being a victim to what would be described as the perpetrator. You have a lot of the pimps who started off as being children who were drugged and kept under the bed most of their childhood because they were unruly because their mother was selling sex. And so, you know, they lived in an environment that was full of drugs and all kinds of other things. I'm talking about Asia when I do this. But the point I'm making is that many of the perpetrators that we want to put in jail are, in fact, people who themselves were victim of all types of crime. And during the time when that girl was a victim, everyone's heart goes out. But when she crosses over to become the madam, then all of a sudden the forgiveness is thrown out the window. We have to take these situations from the perspective of the complexity of what we're dealing with here. There's everyone involved, both the perpetrators and the victims are victims of something. They are broken. They have had all kinds of issues and problems. And so, you know, while I recognize there is a situation and I've seen evil people that need to be in jail and they need to be in jail for an extended period of time, I've also seen people who are traffickers who don't really know how they got into this situation. It's kind of like the frog that's thrown into warm water and it heats up very slowly, and before they know it, they're overcome by it. But they just kind of are blinded by the transition of their life going in that direction. I personally am not a fan of the death penalty. I understand that people think it's a deterrent, but I think that much of what happens to these people, they don't think about it from the standpoint of ever getting caught or it's going to affect them. And it's kind of just, it's too much of an eye for an eye. And somewhere in that formula, there has to be room for forgiveness of everybody.
And likewise, myself, I don't believe in the death penalty because I don't believe it solves any problems. I know that in certain countries, I believe it is in Singapore or Malaysia, I think it's Singapore, where they have the death penalty. And for me, as you rightly said, an eye for an eye, even if you've taken out one individual, there'll be somebody who will fill his shoes or her shoes when it comes to this industry, because as some pimps consider themselves, it's a business. And one of our recent guests shared about a family of traffickers. And sometimes it's almost like it is passed on from generation to generation. When we think about rehabilitation, though, what would you say is actually being done for these individuals who end up being incarcerated so they don't come out and then pick up where they left off?
In Asia, rehabilitation is a concept that just isn't really used or understood. And part of the reason for that is that when it comes to sharing your stories with like a counselor or sharing it with a social worker or somebody in the prison system is not considered to be something that people do in that part of the world. You just don't share. And again, a lot of it really comes down to the concept of face again. So you have a person who's incarcerated for a period of time, they do their time, and then when they go out, they just go right back to the same world that they came from. And very few of them repent or change what it is that they're doing because, you know, the difficulty with people who have a prison record anywhere in the world is that nobody wants to hire you. You know, you're damaged goods. And as a result of that, you know, it just propels criminal behavior forward simply because the person doesn't have options, even if they want to go and take a more positive, good path. And it's a problem everywhere.
And even as you're sharing there, it makes me think about Greystone Bakery in Yonkers, New York. And they actually make brownies, which are inside Ben & Jerry's ice cream. However, all the employees in Greystone Bakery are ex-convicts, and the bakery is maybe 30 plus years old now. The founder died 2 Novembers ago. He was a Buddhist American, white American, and he believed in love in action. And I think that's sometimes where we fall short, because when we hear about heinous crimes being committed against another innocent person, and we perceive innocent as someone who's young and vulnerable and has no culpability, we often believe death penalty or incarceration, or that they experience the same thing they have been through. But I really don't feel that is appropriate in any shape or form, because sometimes the reason why they do what they do is because that's all they know, and it's not about justifying. But even you mentioned that people will provide support to that victim, but when she becomes the perpetrator, then people have a different viewpoint and understanding towards her. And even as you were sharing there, I just think it's really sad because so much is not being done to support those who leave prison. And when there's a lack of support and there's a lack of options where employment is concerned, then what does that leave them to do? To go back to where they came from. And in fact, knowing about Greystone Bakery, I first discovered them buying vegan brownies in Whole Foods. And on the back of the packaging, it says that they employ people who are ex-convicts. It's not written in so many words. But I remember reading that over a decade ago and being inspired. And my dream is to one day do the same thing and to provide job opportunities for those who were in prison. In fact, right here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where I am currently, we have 2 prisons. And in one of the prisons, they bake bread, they make tables and chairs, they fix vehicles. And there are some who will come out, they're reformed, repentant, with new skills. Others may come out worse, but of course, we know that God is more than able to change the heart of anybody. If he can turn the heart of stone into flesh, as he's done in the Bible, why would he not do that now? And so I really think it's about allowing those people, when they leave, those ex-convicts, to be given that second chance to turn their life around. But of course, we don't want to forget about the victims. Providing support for victims is really important. That is crucial. And even though in the West we have great facilities and services, there is still not enough. There is not enough funding. When it comes to a place like Asia, what support do victims get if they do disclose or they're rescued? Is counseling and therapy an option? Is that available? Because of course, as you've mentioned many a time, the shame is one of the reasons that they may not disclose. But if they do, what support is available and how effective is it?
Well, let me just talk about the resources and then I'll segue into your question. I indicated that the number of people that were helped was about 0.2%. And that's partly because the profits generated from modern slavery are 150 billion US dollars a year. The amount of money that's used globally to fight it is about 350 million, or 0.2% of the profits. So the problem is this big and the resources are this big. And so that's part of the reason why we're not able to make a difference. When it comes to even having funding, available, once again, in Asia, unless you have people who can provide the counseling, who have the training and the skills and the understanding of how to help a person through post-traumatic stress syndrome and various other things that they're experiencing, you can't find them. I think in Cambodia, they had maybe 6 psychologists and something like less than 20 social workers, and all across Asia, you have the same situation. So you may have shelters and you may even have counseling, but it's not necessarily always what I would describe as a professional kind of counseling with a goal and objective and a target of what you want a person to achieve over a period of time. So it's extremely important for us to be able to find a way of helping cultures that haven't had the experience of social workers and counselors and psychologists to understand what can be done. And again, I go back to my own country. If you were to talk about somebody going to a counselor in the 1960s, they'd say, why are you going to that shrink? What's wrong with you? You crazy? Mental health was perceived to be something that you just never talked about. And you would be embarrassed to go and get help from somebody because there's something inherently wrong with you if you need that type of assistance. All across Asia and Africa and Latin America and much of the world, you have this situation where we just don't have enough people to help a person transition from the trauma to a safe space to get on with their life. And as a result, a certain number of people get re-trafficked. About 40% of people in Asia who have been trafficked often get re-trafficked simply because they don't get the care and support and healing they need to prevent that from happening.
I was just thinking, as you're sharing there, that one of the first things that needs to be done is for the disclosure to take place. And of course, if a person isn't rescued, but they're living at home and the trafficking is taking place by somebody in the community. Because I've heard of stories where we have individuals in foster care, living at home, going to college and university, and being trafficked. When it comes to, for example, sexual abuse in the family, how is that dealt with? Because, of course, first and foremost, the disclosure has to be made. But how easy is it for such a disclosure to be made? And how does such revelation be received? Particularly think about shame and all of that that comes with that.
You know, the question you pose is a very good one, and it's a very complicated one. In sex trafficking, I find that probably 80 or 85% of the people who I have found who have been tricked and deceived into sex trafficking have had some type of physical or sexual abuse, whether it's inside the family or a neighbor or a family member, or they've been raped in certain circumstances. Often that kind of scenario creates almost a vulnerability that allows for the pimps and the madams to use their radar to pick up on a person who has had that situation take place. That scenario is something that I've seen played out over and over again. And so, you know, another part of this issue is that, you know, sometimes in the West, a person is helped out of forced prostitution only to be sent back to the family that created the vulnerability, either incest or some type of physical, sexual, emotional abuse that led to that vulnerability. And so they go right back into the system of trafficking again, because they you know, it perpetuates the cycle that goes on in that type of a environment. When we work with shelters across Asia, one of the first things we do, if we do feel there is the possibility that a girl can go back, there are some families that, despite the shame, they will accept them back, or the girl isn't going to talk about what happened to her. We make sure that the family isn't what created the issue in the first place. And sometimes it is, sometimes it's just, you know, neglect or naivete. They accepted an offer for their daughter to go off to India to work in a house as a domestic helper, only to eventually be forced into prostitution. They really believed that the opportunity was real, and you know, they would be very surprised if they found out otherwise. Other times, you know, I've seen girls who were being abused by their fathers who actually saw human trafficking as a stepping stone. It wasn't a negative, it was a positive, because it got them out of the house, because there's nothing worse than having your father rape you on a regular basis. And then they eventually moved into other things after that. I was in Bangladesh, and one of our researchers mentioned that to one of the ambassadors who was in a room listening to us talk about this, and she almost fell off of her chair, because nobody had ever made that statement about a stepping stone. But it was just something that we saw. There are a lot of people in terrible circumstances, and they go from one terrible circumstance to another. And human trafficking is an example of one of those terrible experiences.
I don't even know what to say. Even when you use the term stepping stone, it's quite a revelation that speaks volumes. And even when I meet survivors of abuse, and God forbid they were raped, particularly when it's incestuous, I find that very hard to understand. Or even when they are raped and have a child as a result and raise that child, I find it very difficult to get my head around, because we can never compare unless we have been in that person's shoes. We do not know what it's like. And so when we're taken aback or thrown by someone using the term stepping stone, it may mess with our heads, but the reality is that's how she was able to describe her experience. And that's one of the things I think is so important, that we truly cannot judge other people, because we have no idea why they do what they do or why they respond the way that they do. Even just yesterday, I was sharing with somebody that when it comes to grooming and abuse, we may teach our children nobody should touch your private parts, or that they should scream or say no or stop. But often the reason why people like myself and others are abused systematically for years is because when you're groomed, it's such a subtle process. And even at the beginning, you shared about an individual coming to a village and offering money, etc. That therefore can be deemed a form of grooming because you see a person's need, you meet it. We know through the internet, grooming takes place. And in fact, I was saying that there's legislation that has had to change. Laws in the West have had to adapt because we have cyber sex crime and all these offenses. And so I feel it's important for us to become knowledgeable. The Bible does not lie. The Bible is sharper than a double-edged sword. And it says people perish for lack of knowledge. I think that often we as humans, we can look at a situation and feel ashamed or embarrassed that our child has become victim to something. We can put blame and responsibility. But instead, we need to not do that. The Bible says we've overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. And in places like Asia, there's still so much to be done for them to see that truly all things do work together for good. But it is astounding. And I meet many people who are human and who judge and will see a single mother and will judge her for getting pregnant outside of marriage. They'll see a teen mom or a young girl who's pregnant, not realizing the pregnancy is a result of incest or rape. And even recently, I was watching a documentary, well, two. One was about the hidden shame of Pakistan. And it talks about how the boys in Pakistan are often raped by bus drivers and that there's a lot of homosexuality that goes on in Pakistan. And when I watched the video, I was like, that's the next country I want to go to. I'm not taking any vaccine in Jesus' name, but I want to go to Pakistan. And another documentary that I saw was with regards to BBC Eyewitness News, I think it's called, and it was about girls in universities in Nigeria and Ghana who are having sex for grades. The documentary is called Sex for Grades. And I watched the documentary and the journalist went undercover. And as you hear them talk about their experience and you see the undercover footage, it's a frightening experience because you're right there with her as she is being groomed or he's attempting to groom her. And grooming, I feel, is what is often one of the most powerful ways for a perpetrator to take advantage of you. Because as I shared with somebody, that one of the reasons why children will not disclose necessarily about abuse is because they're groomed. And I said, I believe grooming is more powerful than when you're threatened into silence. It's a very gradual process. And even more so, what about when the parent, the family members say to the child, if anybody ever abuses you or hurts you, I will kill them. When you've been groomed and your perpetrator of abuse becomes your friend or ally, you would not want anything to happen to them, so you protect the perpetrator. Or other times you protect your parents because you know that they would not want you to ever be abused, and so you protect them from that aspect. But I know that abuse is not just happening in universities in Ghana and Nigeria. It's happening in primary schools in Ghana, and I know that it most likely is happening in Asia. If it is happening in Asia, can you tell us a bit about that and what is being done to prevent children from being victimized in a place that should be safe for them when they go for education Monday through Friday?
I do a lot of presentations at schools and I have access to a lot of teachers. It's a topic that just isn't really discussed. Part of the reason why I'm brought in to do discussions is the teachers don't really feel equipped to be able to talk about these topics. And as a result of that, they bring an outside person in to basically bring up the topic. My sense is that, once again, if an incident takes place, if a person is identified as being a part of that process, it's not something that's going to be publicly discussed. It will be, handled between parents and school, and it'll be done very quietly, and there will be no kind of overt kind of discussion about this. It's just one of those secrets that stays in the shadows and that is ignored. And I think that kind of ignoring of the issue that takes place across much of Asia because of shame and embarrassment and, all of the other issues that go along with, again, the issue of face, creates a vulnerability for the perpetrators. They know that they can kind of get away with these things because they know that nobody really wants to address the problem. So I can't answer the question in terms of how pervasive it is because it's not talked about, but it's simply the way things are here in this part of the world when it comes to anything related to sexuality.
And actually, a story that comes to mind in relation to abuse in the family is of a young Asian girl. She was living in Australia at the time, and she went on a school trip when she was around 12, leaving behind her two brothers, her parents, and her aunt. And while she was abroad, her entire family was murdered. And when the police investigated, they had observed that there were no bloody footprints into her bedroom. And later it was discovered who the perpetrator was. But when her parents had all been killed, she wanted to remain in the house despite the fact that they'd been murdered there. And when I was watching the documentary, I was perplexed as to why she'd want to live alone at just 12 and in a house with all those memories and the fact that her entire family had been murdered. She ended up living with her aunt and uncle, and it later came out that her uncle had been sexually abusing her. And the perception from the police was that he had murdered the whole family so he could have complete access to her. And she speaks on a documentary, I believe it's a Canadian documentary, she speaks about her experiences, but she's not particularly comfortable going into the fact she was abused. However, she is moving forward. She believes that despite what has happened to her, she can really impact and affect a lot of lives positively. And I think that's very inspiring because every one of us has had difficulties in our life, but it's about overcoming those difficulties. And when we have the courage and the voice to be able to speak up because somebody else has been through that or will go through that. And when they see that we have come through the other side, they can be encouraged. They too can, because her whole family was taken. She went back to, I think she was from Hong Kong or China. She went back with the cameraman and she got to see where her parents were from and things. But I cannot imagine what that is like. Your uncle who sexually abused you kills your entire family. Because you're a minor, you have to move in with him and be subjected to that abuse. But the best part of the story, although she was not a Christian, is that she overcame it. She bought herself a dog and she was happy and the dog was loyal to her. So she was able to overcome. And the thing about comparing is we cannot compare what one person goes through, because what may be difficult for one is not difficult for another. There are people who would lose their whole family and would end up being destroyed, but she's able to take each day as it comes and to focus on the future, which is really, truly amazing. However, I know in Asia, because she was growing up in Australia, in Asia, of course, as you said, the culture is very, very different from that of the West. When you're Asian growing up in the West, your parents quite often will adapt or adjust in some shape or form. Why would you say, though, that Asian children in Asia are most vulnerable to sexual abuse?
I think part of the reason why Asian children are vulnerable to sexual abuse is that they don't know anything about sexuality. They don't get taught. Like one of the things that I did when I was in Bangladesh is to try to put a reproductive health curriculum in place for adolescents, for both boys and girls, because the average kind of 12-year-old Asian Bangladeshi girl found out about her period with nobody telling her about it. Just imagine if you're a young girl and nobody tells you about blood coming out of you and that you experience it. You know, many of these girls would go on for weeks and months not telling anybody, not knowing what was going on, thinking that they were dying. You know, there are all kinds of issues related to, you know, helping people to understand as they move into relationships, because you're talking about early marriages between people where 12, 13-year-olds get married and they don't know anything about sexuality. They don't know anything about, you know, how to be affectionate to their partner and what is sex. And many of them have been getting the information from pornography because it's readily available online now and so forth. And so this absence of appropriate information that helps a person to understand what sexuality can and should be is absent. And when something is wrong, what to do, you know, and who to talk to, and you know, even understanding that there are things that are wrong need to be addressed. And so part of the problem that I have working in Asia is the lack of acceptance within the culture to move in the direction of providing that type of education. I mean, the type of education that you're describing, where you go in and you get a person to go and tell a teacher or a parent about things, there are schools that are years and years and years away from that type of message getting across to anybody. It's just not something that people want to talk about.
Just now you mentioned about them being married and entering into a sexual relationship, not even understanding what sex is, and the fact that they are a child and that they're educated about sex through the means of the internet and pornography. And I think the internet definitely has its pros and its cons, but it's disturbing that that is how these children are learning. Not all, but many of these children are learning, because the reality is what we've seen in pornography is not the reality of how a loving sexual relationship within the confines of marriage should be. But of course, what you made reference to right there is child marriage. What is the legal age of consent, and what are your feelings on child marriage?
Well, I'm a public health person, and so, there's a certain age period when people should be involved in trying to procreate and may have children, and it's not 11 and 12 and 13 years old. In some cultures, they marry their girls off because they don't want the possibility of the girl to be raped or used by anybody prior to marriage. And so you avoid that scenario within the household by just having it be somebody else's problem. The human body at that age is not developed enough in many cases to be able to sustain a healthy pregnancy. And so from a public health standpoint, much of what I worry about is a scenario where the early marriage just is from the biological standpoint, from the emotional standpoint, from the spiritual standpoint, just totally inappropriate. And I know people say, well, it's our tradition, but I just think your tradition is dangerous. It's dangerous to the development of those two individuals, because there's a point at which you just need to allow a child to be a child. And, when they get to a point where they cross over to being an adult, okay, that's fine. But, child marriage is something that just really is a big problem in that part of the world.
And I'm just thinking there about how just because something is legal does not make it okay. And I know in Paul's writings, he says something along the lines of that not everything is permissible, et cetera, just because the law of that country says it's okay doesn't mean that it is. And as you rightly mentioned earlier, that things are changing. In the US, many years ago, it was okay to have a slave who was my color. In the US, many years ago, it was okay to do X. And so things are changing, we are evolving. We know that God is the same yesterday, today, forever. But of course, as we have seen, people sometimes will take scriptures and the Bible out of context to justify what they do, which even makes me think about when we hear stories in Ghana, Nigeria, in Jamaica, of pastors who say that they can heal a person, and that person is required to, for example, in a story in Jamaica, go to a cemetery, lie completely naked, and then the pastor will give them medicines through engaging in sexual activity. When I hear things like this, we can see that is the abuse of power, and people are taking advantage. They are allowing an innocent, naive person to be used and abused for their own enjoyment. I'm struggling to articulate because I don't want it to sound like I'm endorsing or condoning what is being done. And the fact of the matter is, it is not okay in Jamaica for that to take place, nor in Ghana. But we know that there are people who may say, well, Solomon had many wives, so polygamy is okay. Now, I want to ask, just as we wrap up, if someone is listening in and they have been abused, God forbid, by someone in a position of power, a pastor, a teacher, family member, or worst case, trafficked, what advice would you have to give them if they're listening in? Because the reality is that most victims don't believe they're a victim. When that lady went to the cemetery in Jamaica and was nude and things, she thought the pastor was going to remove a demon from her. She was naive and innocent. But what about if that person actually comes to the revelation or the realization that what is happening is not right and it is a crime? What advice would you have for them if they happen to be listening in today?
Well, there's two parts to that. One is, anyone who kind of doesn't really have enough information to understand kind of what it is that we're describing today in terms of how it affects people, I encourage them to go online and look at all of the videos and the articles and the exposés that talk about the concept that we've discussed, which is grooming and how do people get involved in taking advantage of others. And once you have that information, share it with your friends and your family members and so forth within your community, because that's a way of protecting yourself. If you are in a situation where you lose control of your life and you can't leave it, then, some people who are victims say, well, I got myself in that situation. Well, what you got yourself into is an illegal, inappropriate scenario. There's no scenario in which, if you can't leave, that it's appropriate under any circumstances, whether there's debts or threats or whatever. And you just need to find a way of just getting yourself out of that situation. If you're able to run, then you run. If you're able to get a hold of a phone, call somebody, call the police, call whoever. There's no scenario where a person is entrapped in a situation that warrants a person not having an access to it being wrong and inappropriate. And I just urge people to inform yourselves and understand, and that's kind of an antidote to preventing it from happening, but also giving you the tools and the means to know what to do if it does happen.
Thank you. And do you have any last words just in the last minute or so?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my general message to people is that, the world needs a lot of help. You heard in this particular issue, 0.2% of the people are being helped, but there are many, 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 many issues that are out there. And what I often say to people is figure out what your issue is, accept some responsibility, and go out and do something to address it, because there's never enough church people or government people or NGO people or United Nations people. We need to all accept some responsibility for this world. We use the resources, we benefit from it. And the only way the world is going to kind of get beyond even where we are here now in COVID with all the issues and the problems is if we come together as a world and just do what we can to help.
Thank you. And just before you go, do you have any contact information in case somebody would like to provide support, whether they happen to be in Hong Kong, whether it's financial, or to get a copy of your book, or books, plural?
Yeah, I mean, Matthew, I'm on the internet through my organization called the Mekong Club. You can Google that. There's Matthew Friedman public speaking website. There's a coaching website. If you just put Matthew Friedman coaching or Matthew Friedman speaking, there's information. There's a means of contacting me through that if you have questions or comments or things that you want to suggest, and I'm happy to respond to those requests.
Thank you so much. It's really been an eye-opener having you on the show. At points I was speechless, and I'm never speechless. So thank you so much for sharing with us. You've definitely opened my eyes, and I believe the audience have been educated and empowered. So I really want to thank you again, Matthew, for being here. And as I said, I wish you have many more years on this earth to do tremendous work to change lives. And I pray we'll meet, if not on earth, most definitely in heaven. But thank you so much, and God bless you.
Well, thank you for being a great moderator and for excellent questions and for contributing yourself and for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And thank you for those of you who've been listening to PsyCast Diaries. I trust the information has been useful to you. I believe we all need knowledge and education to better safeguard the children in our world. If you would like to get a copy of my new book, Can You Keep a Secret? If you'd like to find out about my weekly Zoom and podcasts, you can contact me on my website, changingcases.org. That's changingcases.org. Remember to share this video with friends and family members. It is all about educating and empowering those in your world so that it will be a safer place. As we know, education is liberation. God bless you, and please tune in again next week for another episode of Can You Keep a Secret?
lonely deep inside, and I wanna talk about it. Can I trust you on my side? Cause I wanna talk about it. Dude, can you keep a secret? Keep a secret. Can you keep a secret? Oh, keep a secret. Can you keep a secret? I wanna trust you. I wanna trust you. So can you keep my secret? You see this road gets tough, gets cold, but still never lose that hope. You got everything it takes and more. You're not alone in this war. Help is on the way every other day. You can lean on my shoulders, cause you are superhuman. You got my trust, and together we can be stronger. So we can talk about it. Yeah, we can talk about it, yeah. So we can talk about it. Talk about it, yeah, let's talk about it, yeah. I feel lonely deep inside, and I